Class, welcome back. Week 12, The 400 Blows, directed by Francois Truffaut. This is the French New Wave. Okay, take a second, review, pause, think of what we talked about last week. Italian neorealism. Take a second, generate that. Remember what actor's business is. Think about those things. Okay, hit the pause button, hit play when you're done. The year's 1959, it's France. Okay, we're going from Italy to France. Now, last week when we talked about Italian neorealism, one of the things that defines neorealism is the fact that the directors who started it were very experienced studio directors. Now we jump over to France. We're talking a decade later, and it's similar in a lot of ways what happens, but the background of the directors is different. Okay, so let's go back in time for a second. France, 1950s film. France has a proud film culture, still does. In the 1950s, one of the things going on in France was that they built a number of institutions and schools. They were striving toward technical aptitude. They were training people to try and be able to make Hollywood-scale quality films. A number of critics writing at the time thought that the filmmakers coming out of those systems weren't great auteurs. They didn't have artistic voices. They were just good at the technical stuff. One of those critics, arguably the harshest critic, was a guy named Francois Truffaut. Francois Truffaut starts off as a critic writing for a magazine or a publication called Cahiers du Cinéma, which just means notes on cinema. And he's a critic, so he's sort of studying cinema, and he's writing about contemporary French cinema as well as American, Italian, European, global cinema. And he becomes known as the harshest critic of French cinema. So if somebody makes something bad, he's unrelenting in his reviews that he prints. He is so polarizing that in 1958 he's banned from the Cannes Film Festival because he's controversial. So this guy who is a critic, Francois Truffaut, decides he's going to try and make his own film. He's going to make his first film. And he made some shorts, but he's going to make his first feature. And the first feature is called The 400 Blows. And it's a coming-of-age story about a young man. It's very similar, actually, thematically. It feels like Catcher in the Rye. So he makes this film, and a year later it gets into Cannes, and he wins the Cannes Film Festival. So it's an amazing reversal of fortune in a year's time. The film gets sold. He actually made quite a bit of money off of it. So did anybody associated with it. And to date, it is considered it's the first French New Wave film, and it's among the most famous of this sort of cluster of films. So it's the first domino to fall. And what defines it? Well, what defines it is, first of all, youthful energy. It's kind of a rebellious movement. These aren't people who went to film schools. These aren't people who worked in Hollywood or worked in studios. They were just fans of film. Most of them, if not all of them, had like a deep critical background. Like they really knew a lot about film from watching it. And many of them were straight up artists. They'd already been trained as artists but hadn't done anything in film. So Truffaut makes this first film. It's very low budget, uses location shooting, non-professional actors. Does this sound familiar? Right? Sounds just like Italian neorealism, with one critical distinction. He is not a trained director, right? He's not coming out of a system that trained him like the studios. So what happens is the film is incredibly successful, and he's approached by a producer who's really smart. And the producer sees that this guy figured out how to make a very cheap film that makes a lot of money. And he says to Truffaut, can you and do you know others who can make more films like this, and I'll finance them. So what happens is Truffaut's friend, a guy named Jean-Luc Godard, gets funding because of Truffaut. Truffaut basically recommends him. Godard makes a film not too long after this one. I don't know the year exactly. It could be a couple years or a few years later, but he makes a film called Breathless. And together, these two films are arguably, there's others, but they're among the most famous French New Wave films. So if we look at this second slide real quick, and I kind of jammed through the first one. The things that define this movement are this sort of youthful energy. It's not punk rock, but it has that same thing that punk rock had, where it's a bunch of people who want to say something. They're not super concerned with like the technical characteristics of the product. They kind of use it in a raw way and in a new way. So they had a deep critical and historical knowledge of cinema. They were influenced, without a doubt, by the Italians a decade earlier. Location shooting, documentary style camera work, and they used a lot of available light. What that means is instead of using film lights where you set up lighting in a space, they would just use whatever light was available. And the notice is three-point light. Three-point light is a standard system for lighting in Hollywood. And this is like a picture. I'll show you a photo of this using three-point light. So in this photo you can see there's a bright source from her face, top right. There's another source, top left, that's not as bright, and it doesn't destroy the shadow, but it softens the shadow. And there's a backlight that's giving a rim around her head that make that little halo. So it takes three lights to get this look, and that's called three-point lighting. The French New Wave filmmakers in general did not use much three-point lighting. They would just use available light. Sometimes they did. It was experimental, and then they had access to smaller and lighter cameras. So before World War II, there weren't very many really small 35mm or 16mm cameras. After the war, there's quite a few of them that are available. It makes shooting faster, cheaper, and by faster, I mean it's easier to move. So before we jump back to talking about the 400 blows for a second, I want to talk about something that happened in the French New Wave aesthetically. One of the new developments, and it's not really Truffaut who did it, it's Jean-Luc Godard who did it, that second filmmaker I mentioned. Godard made a film called Breathless, and in it he used jump cutting as like a staple methodology aesthetically within the film. A jump cut is a cut, an edit point, where things in the frame, without explanation, change place. They just move. So here's the jump cut. You ready? Here's going from here to here to here to here to here. So it's jarring, and before this movement, jump cutting was considered a mistake. Well, it could be two things. It could be a mistake that the filmmaker made. They put the camera in the wrong place. More often, jump cutting was a product of damaged film. So remember that film, really until quite recently, when you showed a film back at a movie theater, it was on big reels. And the theater could show the same reel 100 times for different audiences, 2 times a day for a month. If the film broke, which it could very easily, the projectionist, that's the person whose job it was to project the film, would imagine there's a break right there and the break is rough. They would trim the film off. You might lose 4 frames, and then they would tape it back together. And that would produce a little tiny jump. Right? See that? It's like a little tiny jump in the motion because those 4 pictures were missing. So jump cutting was associated with like damaged film for a long time, or a bad camera placement from the director. It was considered a no-no. Godard, who is still working, he had a very rebellious spirit, he used jump cutting as like a statement in a new aesthetic style. And really since then, to a certain extent, I mean, if you know what you're doing, you can jump cut a film all the time, and audiences can read it and understand it as a piece of grammar. So that came out of the French New Wave. Okay, so let's take a look at a clip from Breathless. This is Jean-Luc Godard's film, that first one that used jump cutting. Now what I want you to look for is just look for the jump cuts where objects kind of change, their place in space. Go for it.
Hé hé hé. Pa, pa, pa. Pa. C'est beau le soleil. Les femmes au volant, c'est la lâcheté personnifiée. Pourquoi elles dépassent pas? Ah oui, merde, des travaux. Il ne faut jamais freiner. Comme disait le vieux père Bugatti, les voitures sont faites pour rouler, pas pour s'arrêter. Merde, la flicaille. Il a sauté. Piège à con.
Ne bouge pas ou je te brûle.
Okay, so that's Jump Cut, cool, right? So because of these guys, and there's also women who made these films in the French New Wave. Agnes Varda is amazing. She's a French New Wave filmmaker. We now kind of have more language. It's a new piece of language we got from this particular movement. Real quick, let's talk about the endings of these films. Last week was not a French New Wave film, but it was a very different type of film than most Americans are used to, mainly because of the ending. Had kind of an abrupt ending without a complete perfect closure at the end. This week you have a similar ending. And for most Americans, these are like kind of irritating or frustrating. So, and you know, that's a legitimate comment, but you have to ask yourself, like, why do we culturally always expect happy endings in films? If you look at other art forms that we consume heavily, pop music, for example, we don't expect every pop song to be happy, right? Look at like an album like someone from like Adele, right? The whole record is sad. And at the end of each song, she doesn't like correct and say, hey, everything worked out fine, never mind. You can say the same thing about books. There's plenty of books that are published in the States that are popular that don't have perfect happy endings. For some reason with film, Americans have been conditioned that the only ending is sort of a perfectly closed happy ending. I'm sure it comes from Hollywood. It's an easier film to sell. But if you think about film as an art form, it is not legitimate to expect every film to have like a perfect happy ending, right? So what I'd say is that as you watch these, try and expand yourself and think of film as much more broadly like you think of other art forms, and accept that they can have very different endings and not just these standard Hollywood endings. Sometimes I'll call those endings existential. That's just fancy language to impress people. Okay, now let's talk about the 400 Blows a little bit. The 400 Blows, again, is the first French New Wave film. In terms of its formal attributes, by which I mean like how it's shot, how it's edited, how the actors move, it is not revolutionary. It's pretty straightforward, it's very basic. But the spirit of the film at the moment that it came out was very different than what was happening in France. So it was in 1959. Truffaut tells what is actually a very personal story. Truffaut, the director, had a really bad childhood. He had really serious issues with his relationships to his parents. He was not an orphan, but sort of an orphan. He didn't know who his father was. So you can see like a really deep reflection in the story he's telling in the film. And there's a gravity to the film, there's a beauty to the film that is pretty unusual if you think of more commercial stuff. So that is really the essence of the French New Wave, is this sort of personal artistic vision for film. And it's a particularly French feel. So a lot of these films, now if you look at the Italian neorealists, a lot of the Italian neorealists, the films have sort of a political and so broad social theme, like kind of looking at the larger world in Italy. The French New Wave, these films are way more useful. There's way more sort of stuff about sexuality and relationships and love. There's also some sort of winking and quoting of like classic American genres, noir, and even some comedy stuff. They love, by the way, almost all of these directors really liked Hollywood films, so it's not a snobby movement at all. It was inclusive. Anyway, so as you watch, just a couple things to remind yourself of as you're going through it. This last slide, just to kind of drive things home, look at the locations where they're shooting and see how simple they are. And then just look for actors' business. Truffaut does a nice job of sort of filling the scenes up with reality in terms of how the actors are interacting with the space. Okay, that's a lot of talking. Now this week we have an unusual setup for the post-assessment thing. There are 3 post-assessment questions from this lecture and this film. Then there's the quiz. The quiz is 15 questions, okay? So the quiz goes from week 6 to last week, covers all that. You have post-assessment with 3 questions from this lecture, okay? Hope you guys enjoyed the film. This is really beautiful stuff. And that is it. Break a leg with the quiz. Take your time. Study the notes before you do it, and I hope you do great. Okay, have a great week.